Picture yourself in a Victorian dining room, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and mahogany furniture, with servants in white gloves attending to guests. The air is filled with the aroma of roasted duck, truffle oil, and Burgundy wine. Then someone brings out the main attraction. A carved Egyptian wooden box containing ground-up human remains, 3,000-year-old flesh dried and crushed into fine brown powder. And they're about to consume it, not out of desperation or madness, but because they're wealthy. For 2 centuries, this was considered normal. This is the story of the mummy trade, a bizarre and disturbing market where human corpses became commodities. Grave robbers became millionaires, and European aristocrats literally consumed Egyptian history. During the same era that brought us the Industrial Revolution, banks, and booming stock markets, wealthy people were grinding up mummies and using them like medicine. The strangest part is that this entire industry started because of a simple mistranslation. In 10th century Persia, there was a black, tarry substance that oozed from the ground in certain regions. Locals called it mumia, essentially natural asphalt formed from ancient organic matter compressed underground over millennia. This substance actually had genuine medicinal properties, helping with inflammation, bone fractures, and internal bleeding. Persian and Arab physicians began prescribing it. Trade routes opened up, and demand grew throughout the region. Then European traders made a catastrophic mistake. When they heard about this miracle substance called mumia coming from Egypt, described as dark, sticky, organic, ancient, preserved, and medicinal, they looked at Egyptian mummies wrapped in resin-soaked bandages, dark and sticky from centuries of preservation, and concluded they had found the source. They were completely wrong, but by the time anyone realized the mistake, a market had already formed. Once there's a market, truth becomes irrelevant, and only supply and demand matter. By the 12th century, European apothecaries were selling mumia as medicine, but it was no longer the mineral pitch from Persia. It was actual ground-up human bodies from Egyptian tombs, powdered flesh, crushed bone, and fragments of organs dried in the desert for 3,000 years. Doctors prescribed it for headaches, bruises, paralysis, stomach pain, coughs, epilepsy, and plague. This wasn't medicine for the poor who couldn't afford corpse dust. This was premium, high-end, luxury-grade human remains that only the wealthy could purchase. The logic behind this practice was insane by modern standards, but it made sense within the twisted medical framework of the time. European physicians believed in vitalism, the idea that living things contained an animating force that remains even after death. Egyptian mummies were considered special because they'd been preserved through ritual embalming with oils, natron salts, and resins, meaning their life force was supposedly still trapped inside. Consuming the mummy meant absorbing that essence and taking their vitality into your own body. It was essentially cannibal logic dressed in academic robes, but it sold exceptionally well. By the 16th century, mummy powder was everywhere. Pharmacies in London, Paris, and Rome all stocked it on their shelves next to herbs and minerals, labeled in Latin and sold by the ounce. Prices varied depending on quality, with a well-preserved mummy from a pharaoh's tomb commanding premium prices, while a common laborer's corpse from a shallow grave sold as discount budget medicine. As demand grew, wealthier clients wanted guarantees and certification. Apothecaries began advertising authentic Egyptian mummy versus knockoff products, because corpse fraud was rampant. Some dealers would grind up recently deceased criminals, dry them out, coat them in tar, and sell them as ancient Egyptian remains in a black market for counterfeit body parts. The French doctor Ambroise Paré, one of the most respected surgeons of the 16th century, wrote about the prevalence of fake mummy powder being sold in Europe, though that didn't stop him from using it anyway. He just complained about quality control. King Francis I of France carried a pouch of mummy powder mixed with rhubarb everywhere as his personal emergency medicine. Queen Elizabeth I's court physicians prescribed it, and Shakespeare even referenced it in his works. This wasn't fringe weirdness, but mainstream medical practice. Where there's demand, there's always someone ready to supply. At this point, Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire, not yet colonized, but already being economically exploited by foreign powers. European traders had access and money, and they wanted mummies in large quantities. This gave birth to a new industry, industrialized grave robbing. Local Egyptian laborers, desperate for income, began raiding tombs, not the famous protected ones, but the smaller necropolises, commoner burial sites, and forgotten catacombs where thousands of bodies sat perfectly preserved by the dry desert heat. These bodies were now worth money. Teams of diggers worked at night, cracking open tombs, pulling out mummies, stripping off the wrappings, and loading the bodies onto carts. Even the resin-soaked linen bandages were sold separately because some apothecaries believed the resins had medicinal value. Nothing went to waste, as every part of the corpse had a price. By the 17th century, this had become a full-scale trade operation with European merchants establishing supply chains, negotiating with middlemen in Cairo and Alexandria, and arranging shipments. Mummies were loaded onto ships in wooden crates and stacked like cargo, sailing across the Mediterranean to European ports where customs officers waved them through without question. It was treated as just another commodity, like spices, textiles, or coffee, except it was human beings. The economics grew even darker as the supply of ancient, well-preserved mummies began running low. The dealers didn't stop. They simply adapted by using fresher corpses from executed criminals and enslaved people, anyone whose body could be obtained cheaply and processed quickly. They'd dry these bodies in the sun, coat them in bitumen to make them look old, and sell them as Egyptian mummies. Johann Schroeder, a German physician, even published a guide in the 1600s on identifying real versus fake mummy powder, advising that the real stuff smells sweet, dissolves easily in vinegar, and has a glossy sheen, while anything that smells rotten is probably just a recently dried corpse. His recommendation was to always buy from a reputable corpse dealer. The French naturalist Pierre Paumet wrote a detailed account of the mummy trade in 1694, explaining that the best mummies came from Saqqara, the ancient burial grounds near Cairo. He described how dealers would crack open skulls to extract brain matter, which was apparently a premium product, and noted that Jewish and Christian mummies weren't as valuable. It had to be Egyptian, ancient, and pagan. He wrote about all this as if he were reviewing wine vintages, showing no awareness of how bizarre the entire enterprise was. The situation became even more absurd when some wealthy Europeans, not trusting the powder, wanted whole mummies as proof. Dealers began selling entire intact, wrapped bodies ready for display. Rich collectors bought them as curiosities and hosted parties where the main attraction was unwrapping a mummy. They'd invite guests, serve champagne, and peel away the linen bandages layer by layer like some grotesque game show. When they reached the dried, brown, stiff body itself, they'd break off pieces, pass them around, sometimes grind them up right there or keep them as trophies. Thomas Pettigrew, a British surgeon in the 1800s, became famous for hosting public mummy unwrappings in London where he charged admission. People actually paid money to watch someone desecrate a 3,000-year-old corpse in a theater, and it was popular entertainment. Every aspect of this trade, from beginning to end, was driven purely by money. The apothecaries made money, middlemen made money, the grave robbers made money, the ship captains made money, and the collectors made money by reselling at auctions. Everyone profited except the dead Egyptians, whose bodies were being turned into powder and party tricks. The scale of this trade was staggering. An English merchant in the 1600s reported that a single shipment from Egypt could contain hundreds of mummies. Conservative estimates suggest that over 2 centuries, tens of thousands of bodies were removed from Egypt and sold in Europe, though some historians believe the actual number was far higher. The prices were substantial as well. In 1600s London, a pound of quality mummy powder could cost around 4 shillings, roughly equivalent to a week's wages for a laborer. A whole mummy, intact and well-preserved, could cost several pounds sterling, enough to buy a horse or small house. This wasn't just a curiosity trade, but a functioning, profitable market built entirely on human desecration. And the medical establishment backed it. Not just quacks and conmen, but real doctors, university-trained physicians who wore robes, held titles, and wrote dissertations defending the practice. They cited ancient authorities. They debated dosage with the same seriousness we reserve for chemotherapy today. They argued whether mummy powder worked better, dissolved in wine, or mixed with honey, as if the delivery method was the problem, not the fact that they were prescribing ground-up human beings. The German-Swiss physician Paracelsus, one of the founders of toxicology, prescribed mummy openly. He called it one of the great arcana of medicine, a substance that contained a universal healing force. Other physicians argued with him about details, but never about the premise. No one stood up in a lecture hall and said, maybe we shouldn't be eating dead people. Almost no one, anyway. A few dissenting voices did emerge. Ambroise Paré, the famed French surgeon, eventually wrote that mummy medicine was disgusting, useless, and morally wrong. He said it upset the stomach, smelled foul, and caused more harm than good. But even Paré admitted that earlier in his career, he had used it himself. He didn't stop because he found the practice fundamentally insane. He stopped because he decided it didn't work. Ethics lagged behind efficacy. And while a few men hesitated, the market did not. Because once a commodity is established, once infrastructure exists, once demand is normalized, the system sustains itself. You no longer need belief. You no longer need justification. The market becomes its own logic. By the 18th century, mummy powder was so ordinary that it appeared in official pharmacopoeias and medical textbooks. It sat on shelves beside mercury, opium, and arsenic, just another ingredient in the physician's toolkit. Some doctors even refined the madness further, prescribing specific types of mummy for specific ailments. Mummy from a young body for vitality, mummy from an old body for wisdom and longevity, mummy from a warrior for strength. It was a grotesque wine pairing guide, except the tasting notes were written on corpses. This wasn't fringe behavior. This was mainstream medicine. The shift didn't come because of a sudden moral awakening. It came because supply chains broke and science caught up. By the late 1700s, European access to Egypt grew complicated. The Ottoman Empire tightened regulations. Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, turning the region into a geopolitical battlefield. Trade routes fractured, prices rose. At the same time, Enlightenment-era scientists began asking uncomfortable questions. Chemists analyzed mummy powder, broke it down, tested it, and found nothing special. No unique compounds, no mystical essence, just decayed organic matter, carbon, nitrogen, trace minerals. Nothing you couldn't get from grinding up any corpse, or better yet, from not grinding up corpses at all. Antoine Laurent de Lavoisier dismissed mummy medicine as superstition, and others followed. Medical journals published studies showing it had no therapeutic effect. The intellectual scaffolding collapsed, but the trade didn't vanish overnight, because markets don't care about truth. They care about demand. The price simply shifted. Mummy stopped being medicine and became curiosity, something to own, to display, to talk about at dinner parties. And that's when the story becomes even darker. Because while Europe had spent centuries consuming mummies as medicine, the 19th century found new uses for them. Industrial uses. Egyptian mummies became raw materials, specifically their linen wrappings. Linen soaked in resins, preserved for millennia, durable and plentiful. European manufacturers bought mummies in bulk, stripped off the bandages, cleaned the resin, and pulped the fabric into paper. Actual paper. One mill in Maine imported tons of mummy wrappings in the 1850s and turned them into brown butcher paper. Workers began getting sick. Respiratory infections, fevers, unexplained illnesses. Ancient bacteria, dormant for 3,000 years, don't simply disappear. When disturbed, they return. The mill shut down after outbreaks of disease, but not before thousands of sheets of mummy paper circulated across New England. Other mummies were burned for fuel. Mark Twain wrote about Egyptian railways using mummies to power locomotives because wood was scarce and coal was expensive. Twain may have exaggerated, he was a satirist, but the fact that the story was believable tells you everything. Thousands of years of human history reduced to combustible waste. Even if it happened only once, the plausibility alone is damning. By the mid-1800s, mummies were so common in Europe that they were destroyed for entertainment. Victorian elites hosted unwrapping parties, smashing open bodies in search of jewelry before discarding the remains. Others used mummified limbs as garden decorations, hands, feet, lawn ornaments. At the same time, Egypt itself fell under colonial control. Britain took over in 1882. Archaeological expeditions followed, framed as preservation and scholarship. Tombs were stripped, artifacts packed, bodies shipped to London and Paris. Same extraction, new justification. Now it was science. Now it was education. The bodies were no longer consumed, they were displayed. Museums filled their Egyptian wings with stolen dead. The British Museum, the Louvre, glass cases, labels, tourists pressing their faces close to shriveled skin stretched over ancient bones. No permission, no consultation. Entire burial traditions removed from their homeland and exhibited abroad, while Egypt had no control over its own ancestors. The mummy trade as medicine died by the late 1800s, not because of ethics, but because better products arrived. Morphine, aspirin, vaccines, things that worked. Mummy powder couldn't compete. But the damage was already done. Necropolises emptied, tens of thousands of bodies destroyed, ground up, burned, discarded, or locked behind glass. A civilization's relationship with death, developed over millennia, treated as a resource to be mined, and the economics of it all should haunt you. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a curiosity. It was a system, complete with supply chains, middlemen, investors, and consumers. People made fortunes. Reputations were built. Status was gained. And no one had to see the graves being robbed. They just paid money and received product. That logic never disappeared. You find value, you extract it, you profit, you invent a justification, spices, rubber, silver, human beings, corpses. The mummy trade didn't create imperialism, it revealed it. It showed how easily culture, history, and even bodies become commodities once money enters the equation. We tell ourselves we respect the past, but preservation only happens when it's convenient, when it's profitable, when it serves the present. And the most disturbing part is this. The people involved weren't monsters. They were respectable, educated, law-abiding, doctors trying to heal, merchants meeting demand, collectors appreciating history. No one thought they were evil. That's how atrocities work, not through cruelty but through incentives, not through hatred but through indifference. You don't need villains, you just need a system that rewards extraction and punishes hesitation. So we end where we began, a Victorian dining room, chandeliers, white gloves, a carved wooden box opened at the table. Inside, powdered human remains, consumed not out of madness but fashion, not out of desperation but normalcy. The mummy trade lasted 200 years. It ended when the economics changed. The graves are still empty. The museums are still full. And the lesson remains unlearned. Look for the thing everyone says is fine. The thing that makes money the thing no one questions. That's your next mummy trade. And one day, people will look back and ask the same question we ask now. How did they let it happen? The answer will be the same, one transaction at a time.